It started with a trembling pause inside one of Buckingham Palace's most private reception rooms, a silence so heavy that even seasoned aides reportedly avoided looking Prince Edward directly in the eye. Then came the moment no one expected. Edward, long known as the monarchy's quietest royal, publicly referenced the Queen's final advice to him for the very first time. And according to insiders, what she told him may explain the growing divide now quietly reshaping the House of Windsor. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For decades, Prince Edward existed in the background of royal life, like a steady shadow never demanding attention, never competing for headlines, never openly challenging the machinery of the crown. While other members of the family dominated front pages through scandal, heartbreak, ambition and rebellion, Edward remained something far more dangerous in the eyes of palace insiders: observant. Quiet people inside royal circles are often underestimated until the moment they finally speak, and according to several royal aides, that moment arrived with startling force during his recent appearance. What was expected to be a routine engagement suddenly transformed into something far more personal when Edward's voice reportedly faltered while discussing duty and continuity. Those two words may have sounded harmless to the public, but inside the palace, they landed like a warning shot. Because among the older generation of royal advisors, continuity was one of Queen Elizabeth II's most guarded obsessions during the final years of her reign. She worried constantly about stability, about preserving public trust, about what would happen if personal agendas ever began overpowering institutional discipline. And now, for the first time, Edward appeared to confirm that those fears were shared privately with him shortly before her death. Witnesses close to the event claimed the atmosphere shifted almost instantly after he mentioned the late Queen. Edward was not speaking like a royal performing ceremonial duty. He was speaking like a man carrying the weight of unfinished instructions. Insiders later revealed that several aides exchanged nervous looks as he carefully described the importance of protecting what matters, even when emotions inside the family become complicated. That phrase alone triggered immediate speculation across royal circles because it sounded less like a tribute and more like coded frustration. For years, rumors have circulated that Queen Elizabeth quietly relied on Edward more than the public ever realized. Unlike more senior royals who often operated beneath intense scrutiny, Edward allegedly became a trusted listener during the Queen's most uncertain moments, particularly as tensions surrounding the monarchy intensified from within. And according to palace insiders, the Queen's private guidance to him was not centered on popularity or public image. It was about survival, about ensuring the institution remained intact no matter how painful the personal consequences became. That is why royal commentators became fixated not only on what Edward said, but when he said it. The monarchy is entering one of its most fragile transitional periods in generations. Questions surrounding leadership, loyalty, public trust, and the future identity of the crown have quietly intensified behind closed doors. Every appearance, every gesture, every carefully chosen phrase is now dissected for hidden meaning. And Edward's emotional remarks arrived precisely when whispers of internal disagreements were already spreading through aristocratic circles. Some insiders believe the Queen warned him that future instability would not come from outside attacks or media pressure, but from emotional fractures developing within the family itself. Others claim she feared competing visions for the monarchy would eventually create silent camps inside the palace, each fighting for influence while publicly pretending unity remained untouched. Suddenly, Edward's visible emotion no longer looked accidental. It looked like the burden of someone realizing the warning had already begun unfolding in front of him. And as palace insiders began dissecting Edward's emotional words, attention quickly shifted toward the deeper meaning behind the Queen's final warning, and who inside the monarchy may have ignored it. For years, Prince Edward was often described as the invisible royal, the dependable son who never demanded attention, never chased headlines, and never turned palace duty into spectacle. But behind closed doors, Reports suggest Queen Elizabeth quietly trusted Edward with conversations she withheld from almost everyone else. And according to several royal commentators, those final private meetings at Balmoral may have carried consequences the monarchy is only beginning to understand now. While the world focused on louder figures inside the House of Windsor, Edward occupied a very different role within the family structure. He was not the rebellious prince, not the future king, not the headline magnate whose every movement triggered global debate. He became something far more valuable to Queen Elizabeth during her final years: predictable. In a monarchy increasingly surrounded by emotional fractures, media warfare, and internal uncertainty, predictability became a form of protection. Palace insiders have long suggested that the late Queen grew exhausted by conflict near the end of her reign. Public scandals created private wounds, and beneath the carefully maintained royal image, tensions were reportedly becoming harder to contain. Yet amid all of that instability, Edward remained steady. He listened more than he spoke. He avoided public feuds. He carried out engagements without complaint or drama. And according to several royal historians, those qualities elevated his importance inside palace walls far beyond what the public ever understood. That quiet trust allegedly deepened during the Queen's final months at Balmoral. Staff members close to the estate later hinted that Edward spent far more private time with her than many observers realized. Not ceremonial visits, not formal briefings, real conversations. Long discussions behind closed doors as the Queen reflected on the institution she had spent her entire life protecting. Sources familiar with the atmosphere at Balmoral claimed the late monarch became increasingly focused on one fear above all others: the possibility that emotional divisions within the family could eventually weaken the monarchy itself. She had survived political crises, public criticism, and decades of cultural change. But insiders say what troubled her most in private was the growing sense that unity inside the royal household was beginning to fracture beneath the surface. And in those deeply personal moments, Edward reportedly became one of the few people she trusted enough to speak openly with. Royal commentators now believe those conversations may explain Edward's unusually emotional public remarks in recent months. Because according to multiple interpretations circulating through aristocratic circles, the Queen may have privately tasked him with helping preserve stability after her death, not through power or visibility, but through restraint, through loyalty, through silence. Historians have often noted that Elizabeth valued discretion above charisma. To her, the monarchy survived not because royals were loved every moment, but because certain members understood when to place duty above ego. Edward embodied that philosophy almost perfectly. While others fought public battles or struggled against media storms, he remained disciplined, controlled, and painfully aware of the damage that uncontrolled emotion could inflict on the crown. Some insiders now believe the Queen viewed him as a stabilizing force for a future she feared might become increasingly volatile. And perhaps that is what makes these revelations so unsettling today. Because if Edward truly was asked to hold the line during future disputes, then the Queen may have anticipated far more turmoil than the public realized while she was alive. Suddenly, Edward's silence no longer appears passive. It begins to look strategic, intentional, almost protective. Every careful statement, every measured appearance, every refusal to escalate tensions now carries a different weight entirely. What once looked like invisibility may actually have been preparation for a role designed in private by the late Queen herself. And if those quiet Balmoral conversations truly shaped Edward's actions today, then the Queen may have anticipated a royal crisis long before the public ever saw signs of it. What exactly did Queen Elizabeth tell Prince Edward before her death? That question is now echoing through royal circles after Edward's unusually candid remarks. While no direct details have officially been confirmed, insiders whisper that the Queen's message centered on one principle she believed was under threat inside the modern monarchy: duty before emotion. And according to palace administrative streams, Edward has carried those words like a private burden ever since. For many watching from the outside, Edward's recent comments seemed restrained, even careful. But inside royal circles, the reaction was very different. Palace veterans reportedly understood immediately what he was truly implying when he spoke about protecting the institution above personalities. That phrase alone carried the unmistakable weight of Queen Elizabeth's worldview. For more than 70 years, she built her reign around sacrifice, discipline, and emotional restraint. Personal pain was never allowed to overshadow the crown itself. Even during moments of devastating family turmoil, the Queen maintained the belief that monarchy could only survive if individual desires remained secondary to institutional stability. According to royal historians, that philosophy became even more intense during her final years, as internal tensions inside the family reportedly grew harder to ignore. And now, many believe Edward's words were not simply reflections of his own beliefs, but echoes of conversations the Queen had privately entrusted to him before her death. What shocked commentators most was not the content of Edward's remarks, but the emotion beneath them. Edward has spent decades mastering invisibility. He rarely reveals frustration, rarely invites controversy, rarely speaks in ways that trigger public speculation. Yet during this appearance, something felt different. His tone reportedly carried exhaustion. Not anger, not bitterness, but the weight of someone trying to protect a system he fears may already be under strain. Several observers noted that Edward appeared unusually deliberate when discussing loyalty, continuity, and sacrifice, as though every sentence had been measured against a deeper personal responsibility. And according to insiders familiar with palace operations, those remarks reportedly created immediate discomfort behind closed doors because they reopened difficult conversations the monarchy has spent years trying to contain quietly. The comparisons that followed only intensified the speculation. Commentators quickly contrasted Edward's silence and restraint with the far more public behavior of other royals who have openly challenged, criticized, or emotionally exposed family tensions in recent years. For supporters of the traditional monarchy, Edward suddenly began representing something larger than himself. He became a symbol of the old royal code Queen Elizabeth fought to preserve until the very end, a belief that public service requires silence, even when private wounds become unbearable. But others inside royal circles reportedly viewed his remarks differently. Some feared the emotional nature of his speech risked drawing attention toward fractures the palace desperately wants to appear resolved. That may explain why palace responses afterward seemed unusually cautious. There were no major efforts to amplify Edward's comments publicly, no aggressive attempts to clarify his meaning, just careful silence. And in royal culture, silence often speaks louder than words. Because beneath the calm public image of the monarchy, a deeper struggle may now be unfolding. The institution Queen Elizabeth dedicated her life to protecting is entering a period filled with uncertainty, competing visions, and emotional tension that cannot easily be hidden anymore. Edward's remarks did not create those fears. They exposed them. Suddenly, his loyalty no longer appears passive or ceremonial. It feels defensive, protective, almost like a man attempting to preserve something fragile before it fractures beyond repair. And the more royal experts analyze his words, the more one unsettling possibility continues to emerge. Perhaps the Queen already knew exactly where the greatest dangers to the monarchy would come from after she was gone. But the deeper Edward reflected on the Queen's final guidance, the more attention shifted toward the people many believe she feared could destabilize the monarchy after her passing. Behind the polished ceremonies and carefully controlled royal appearances, reports suggest a far more fragile reality has been unfolding within palace walls. Prince Edward's emotional comments reportedly reopened old anxieties surrounding loyalty, public attacks, and the monarchy's future identity. And according to several royal insiders, the Queen's final advice may have been shaped by growing fears that the institution itself was entering one of its most dangerous transitional periods in decades. The death of Queen Elizabeth did not simply mark the end of a reign. For many inside the royal household, it marked the collapse of the one figure capable of holding together competing personalities, private resentments, and deeply buried tensions that had quietly intensified for years. Her presence had been more than symbolic. It was stabilizing. Even during moments of scandal and emotional conflict, there remained an unspoken belief that the Queen could contain the damage through sheer authority alone. But once that certainty disappeared, palace insiders reportedly began sensing a shift almost immediately. Conversations became more cautious. Loyalties became more visible. Every decision suddenly carried higher stakes, because the monarchy was no longer operating beneath the shadow of the woman who had defined it for over 70 years. And in that uncertain atmosphere, Edward's recent remarks reportedly struck far deeper than the public initially realized. According to royal commentators, Edward's words were interpreted internally as a quiet but unmistakable warning about the direction of the modern monarchy. He never named individuals. He never openly criticized family members. Yet that made his comments even more unsettling. Palace culture has always depended on implication rather than confrontation. And when Edward emphasized sacrifice, discipline, and protecting the institution above personal emotion, many insiders reportedly heard something else beneath the surface: frustration. A frustration rooted in years of watching private royal matters become public battlegrounds. The monarchy has survived wars, political upheaval, and cultural revolutions. But what appears to concern senior royals now is something more personal and unpredictable: the weaponization of family conflict itself. Public interviews, emotional accusations, media narratives, and internal betrayals have created a climate where silence is no longer guaranteed. And according to several palace sources, that reality deeply alarmed Queen Elizabeth before her death. King Charles now reportedly finds himself trapped inside the same struggle his mother feared. On one side stands family loyalty, emotional connection, and personal history. On the other stands institutional survival. Those closest to the palace claim balancing those two realities has become increasingly difficult behind closed doors. Every response risks alienating someone. Every silence creates speculation. Every appearance is examined for signs of division. And according to royal historians, that pressure has only strengthened alliances among certain senior royals who share the late Queen's traditional philosophy. Princess Anne is frequently described as one of the strongest defenders of discipline and continuity inside the family, while Prince William reportedly carries growing concerns about protecting long-term public trust in the crown. Edward's emotional speech suddenly placed him firmly within that same protective circle, a group many insiders believe is becoming increasingly focused on preserving stability before deeper fractures emerge publicly. What unsettled palace staff most, however, was not merely the speech itself, but the reaction afterward. According to whispers circulating through royal administrative circles, Edward's comments triggered immediate private discussions among senior aides. Some reportedly viewed his words as an emotional tribute. Others feared they represented the beginning of something far more dangerous: senior royals quietly acknowledging internal instability in ways that could no longer remain hidden forever. The palace's cautious response only fueled those suspicions. There was no aggressive effort to clarify his meaning, no strong attempt to dismiss speculation, just silence, controlled, deliberate silence. And within royal culture, silence often signals concern more than confidence. Because behind closed doors, many insiders now believe the monarchy is navigating not just a transition of leadership, but a battle over identity itself. And while the public focused on Edward's rare emotional vulnerability, insiders claim something even more startling was happening quietly behind palace doors afterward. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace reportedly changed almost immediately after Prince Edward's speech. What many assumed would pass as a brief emotional tribute instead triggered quiet waves of concern behind royal walls. Senior aides allegedly began dissecting every phrase, every pause, every carefully chosen word. Because according to insiders, Edward had not simply honoured Queen Elizabeth's memory, he had revived her unspoken blueprint for protecting the monarchy during uncertain times. And for older palace figures who served the late Queen loyally for decades, the meaning behind his remarks felt impossible to ignore. In the final months of her reign, Queen Elizabeth rarely spoke publicly about fear, uncertainty, or emotional division. But many now believe that silence concealed something much deeper. Royal historians have started revisiting her final appearances, searching for hidden signals that may have hinted at private concerns surrounding the future of the crown. According to commentators close to palace circles, the Queen understood that the monarchy's next great battle would not be fought over titles or ceremonial power, but over loyalty, discipline, and the survival of duty itself in an age increasingly driven by personal ambition and public exposure. Edward's emotional comments suddenly reopened those fears with startling force. What stunned many observers was how deliberate the speech reportedly appeared afterward. Palace aides allegedly viewed it less as spontaneous emotion and more as a carefully controlled message rooted in the Queen's lifelong philosophy of restraint and continuity. Edward's reputation quietly strengthened among traditional royal supporters, who saw him as one of the last senior royals fully committed to protecting the institution above personal attention. Unlike louder figures who dominated headlines through conflict and emotional revelation, Edward represented silence, sacrifice, and control. The exact values Queen Elizabeth reportedly feared were disappearing from modern royal life. As discussions spread quietly through royal households, speculation began growing that Edward's role inside the monarchy could become far more visible moving forward. Some insiders believe the speech marked a turning point, not because Edward sought power, but because the palace increasingly views stability itself as something fragile that must now be defended carefully. And as the Queen's legacy becomes more deeply tied to discipline and continuity, many traditionalists reportedly see Edward as a quiet guardian of the principles she spent her life protecting. But perhaps the most haunting part of this entire moment is the question now lingering behind palace doors. Because as Prince Edward stepped away from the spotlight once again, attention shifted away from what the Queen may have told him privately and towards something far more unsettling. Whether anyone else inside the royal family truly listened before it was too late. For decades, Prince Edward stood quietly in the background, while louder personalities consumed royal headlines. He never chased attention, never turned private struggles into public spectacle, and never appeared interested in competing for influence inside the House of Windsor. But after his emotional revelation about Queen Elizabeth's final advice, many royal observers believe the monarchy is beginning to see Edward in an entirely different light. Not as the overlooked son of a legendary queen, but as one of the last remaining royals still guided by the old code she spent 70 years defending. In many ways, Edward's speech was never simply about grief. It became something far more haunting, a warning. A reminder that Queen Elizabeth understood the monarchy would face its greatest challenges not from political enemies or outside criticism, but from emotional fractures growing within the family itself. According to insiders, the late Queen feared a future where personal ambition, public conflict, and media warfare could slowly erode the discipline that once protected the crown from instability. And through Edward's quiet but devastating words, that fear suddenly stepped into public view. Royal traditionalists reportedly viewed the moment as deeply significant, while other members of the family became associated with controversy, emotional exposure, or public division. Edward represented restraint, loyalty, and continuity. Commentators began comparing his calm, disciplined approach to the late Queen herself. Palace sources even suggested that Edward has grown increasingly close to Princess Anne and Prince William in recent years, forming what some insiders describe as a protective circle focused on preserving institutional stability during an uncertain era. In a monarchy struggling to balance tradition against modern pressure, Edward's quiet consistency now appears more valuable than ever before. But perhaps the most emotional part of this story is what it reveals about Queen Elizabeth's final years. Many now believe she understood that once she was gone, the monarchy would stand at a crossroads between stability and chaos. Her legacy was never built around popularity alone. It was built around endurance, around sacrifice, around protecting the institution even when personal emotions demanded otherwise. Edward's speech revived those principles with chilling clarity, and some royal commentators already believe the moment may become one of the defining royal speeches of the post-Elizabeth era. Even now, long after the cameras stopped rolling and the palace returned to silence, Edward's words continue echoing through royal corridors like a final warning from the Queen herself. Because beneath the ceremony, beneath the titles, beneath the carefully controlled public image, the real battle facing the monarchy may no longer be about power at all. It may be about whether the values Queen Elizabeth defended for 70 years can survive the modern world she left behind. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.